20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Jules Verne's most fantastic and beloved adventure. Join us now for a quick trip under the waves into a world of the fabulous. If you like this sort of content, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment if you would. On with the tale. Chapter 13. The Iceberg. The Nautilus was steadily pursuing its southerly course, following the 50th meridian with considerable speed. Did he wish to reach the pole? I did not think so, for every attempt to reach that point had hitherto failed. Again, the season was far advanced, for in the Antarctic regions, March 13th corresponds with September 13th of the northern regions, which begin at the equinoctial season. On March 14th, I saw floating ice in latitude 55 degrees, merely pale bits of debris from 20 to 25 feet long, forming banks over which the sea curled. The Nautilus remained on the surface of the ocean. Ned Land, who had fished in the Arctic seas, was familiar with its icebergs, but Conseil and I admired them for the first time. In the atmosphere toward the southern horizon stretched a white, dazzling band. English whalers have given it the name of ice blink. However thick the clouds may be, it is always visible and announces the presence of an ice pack or bank. Accordingly, larger blocks soon appeared, whose brilliancy changed with the caprices of the fog. Some of these masses showed green veins, as if long undulating lines had been traced with sulfate of copper. Others resembled enormous amethysts with the light shining through them. Some reflected the light of day upon 1,000 crystal facets. Others, shaded with vivid calcareous reflections, resembled a perfect town of marble. The more we neared the south, the more these floating islands increased both in number and importance. At 60 degrees latitude, every pass had disappeared. But seeking carefully, Captain Nemo soon found a narrow opening through which he boldly slipped, knowing, however, that it would close behind him. Thus, guided by his clever hand, the Nautilus passed through all the ice with a precision which quite charmed Conseil. Icebergs or mountains, ice fields or smooth plains seemed to have no limits. Drift ice or floating ice packs, plains broken up, called palks when they were circular, and streams when they are made up of long strips. The temperature was very low. The thermometer exposed to the air marked 2 or 3 degrees below zero. But we were warmly clad with fur at the expense of the sea bear and seal. The interior of the Nautilus, warmed regularly by its electric apparatus, defied the most intense cold. Besides, it would only have been necessary to go some yards beneath the waves to find a more bearable temperature. 2 months earlier, we should have had perpetual daylight in these latitudes, but already we had 3 or 4 hours of night, and by there would be 6 months of darkness in these circumpolar regions. On March 15th, we were in the latitude of New Shetland in South Orkney. The captain told me that formerly numerous tribes of seals inhabited them, but that English and American whalers, in their rage for destruction, massacred both old and young. Thus, where there was once life and animation, they had left silence and death. About 8 o'clock on the morning of March 16th, the Nautilus, following the 55th meridian, cut the Antarctic polar circle. Ice surrounded us on all sides and closed the horizon. But Captain Nemo went from one opening to another, still going higher. I cannot express my astonishment at the beauties of these new regions. The ice took most surprising forms. Here the grouping formed an oriental town with innumerable mosques and minarets. There a fallen city thrown to the earth, as it were, by some convulsion of nature. The whole aspect was constantly changed by the oblique rays of the sun, or lost in the grayish fog amid hurricanes of snow. Detonations and falls were heard on all sides, great overthrows of icebergs which altered the whole landscape like a diorama. Often seeing no exit, I thought we were definitely prisoners, but instinct guiding him at the slightest indication, Captain Nemo would discover a new pass. He was never mistaken when he saw the thin threads of bluish water trickling along the ice fields. and I had no doubt that he had already ventured into the midst of these Antarctic seas before. On March 16th, however, the ice fields absolutely blocked our road. It was not the iceberg itself, as yet, but vast fields cemented by the cold. But this obstacle could not stop Captain Nemo. He hurled himself against it with frightful violence. The Nautilus entered the brittle mass like a wedge, and split it with frightful crackings. It was the battering ram of the ancients, hurled by infinite strength. The ice, thrown high in the air, fell like hail around us. By its own power of impulsion, our apparatus made a canal for itself. Sometimes carried away by its own impetus, it lodged on the ice field, crushing it with its weight, and sometimes buried beneath it, dividing it by a simple pitching movement, producing large rents in it. Violent gales assailed us at this time, accompanied by thick fogs, through which, from one end of the platform to the other, we could see nothing. The wind blew sharply from all parts of the compass, and the snow lay in such hard heaps that we had to break it with blows of a pickaxe. The temperature was always at 5 degrees below zero. Every outward part of the Nautilus was covered with ice. A rigged vessel would have been entangled in the blocked-up gorges. A vessel without sails, with electricity for its motive power, and wanting no coal, could alone brave such high latitudes. At length, on March 18th, after many useless assaults, the Nautilus was positively blocked. It was no longer either streams, packs, or ice fields, but an interminable and immovable barrier formed by mountains soldered together. "An iceberg," said the Canadian to me. I knew that to Ned Land, as well as to all other navigators who had preceded us, this was an inevitable obstacle. The sun appearing for an instant at noon, Captain Nemo took an observation as near as possible, which gave our situation at 51 degrees 30 minutes longitude and 67 degrees 39 minutes of south latitude. We had advanced 1 degree more in this Antarctic region. Of the liquid surface of the sea there was no longer a glimpse. Under the spur of the Nautilus lay stretched a vast plain entangled with confused blocks. Here and there, sharp points and slender needles rising to a height of 200 feet. Further, on a steep shore, hewn as it were with an axe and clothed with grayish tints, huge mirrors reflecting a few rays of sunshine half drowned in the fog. And over this desolate face of nature a stern silence reigned, scarcely broken by the flapping of the wings of petrels and puffins. Everything was frozen, even the noise. The Nautilus was then obliged to stop in its adventurous course amid these fields of ice, in spite of our efforts. In spite of the powerful means employed to break up the ice, the Nautilus remained immovable. Of the liquid surface of the sea there was no longer a glimpse. Under the spur of the Nautilus lay stretched a vast plain entangled with confused blocks, here and there sharp points and slender needles rising to a height of 200 feet. Further, on a steep shore, hewn as it were with an axe and clothed with grayish tints, huge mirrors reflecting a few rays of sunshine half drowned in the fog. And over this desolate face of nature a stern silence reigned, scarcely broken by the flapping of the wings of petrels and puffins. Everything was frozen, even the noise. The Nautilus was then obliged to stop in its adventurous course amid these fields of ice. In spite of our efforts, in spite of the powerful means employed to break up the ice, the Nautilus remained immovable. Generally, when we can proceed no farther, we have return still open to us, but here return was as impossible as advance, for every pass had closed behind us, and for the few moments when we were stationary we were likely to be entirely blocked, which did indeed happen about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the fresh ice forming around its sides with astonishing rapidity. I was obliged to admit that Captain Nemo was more than imprudent. I was on the platform at that moment. The captain had been observing our situation for some time past when he said to me, "Well, sir, what do you think of this?" "I think that we're caught, Captain." "So, Monsieur Aronnax, you really think the Nautilus cannot disengage itself?" "With difficulty, Captain, for the season is already too far advanced for you to reckon on the breaking of the ice." "Ah, sir," said Captain Nemo in an ironical tone, "you will always be the same. you see nothing but difficulties and obstacles. I affirm that not only can the Nautilus disengage itself, but also that it can go further still. Further to the south? I asked, looking at the captain. Yes, sir. It shall go to the pole. To the pole? I exclaimed, unable to repress a gesture of incredulity. Yes, replied the captain coldly. To the Antarctic pole, to that unknown point from whence springs every meridian of the globe. You know whether I can do as I please with the Nautilus. Yes, I knew that. I knew that this man was bold even to rashness, but to conquer those obstacles which bristled around the South Pole, rendering it more inaccessible than the North, which had not yet been reached by the boldest navigators, was it not a mad enterprise, one which only a maniac would have conceived? It then came into my head to ask Captain Nemo if he had ever discovered that pole which had never yet been trodden by a human creature. No, sir. But we will discover it together. Where others have failed, I will not fail. I have never yet led my Nautilus so far into southern seas, but I repeat, it shall go further yet. I can well believe you, Captain, said I in a slightly ironical tone. I believe you. Let us go ahead. There are no obstacles for us. Let us smash this iceberg. Let us blow it up, and if it resists, let us give the Nautilus wings to fly over it. Over it, sir, said Captain Nemo quietly. No, not over it, but under it. Under it? I exclaimed, a sudden idea of the captain's projects flashing upon my mind. I understood. The wonderful qualities of the Nautilus were going to serve us in this superhuman enterprise. I see we are beginning to understand one another, sir, said the captain, half smiling. You begin to see the possibility, I should say the success of this attempt. That which is impossible for an ordinary vessel is easy to the Nautilus. If a continent lies before the pole, it must stop before the continent. But if, on the contrary, the pole is washed by open sea, it will go even to the pole. Certainly, said I, carried away by the captain's reasoning. If the surface of the sea is solidified by the ice, the lower depths are free by the providential law which has placed the maximum of density of the waters of the ocean 1 degree higher than the freezing point. And if I'm not mistaken, the portion of this iceberg which is above the water is as 1 to 4 to that which is below. Very nearly, sir. For 1 foot of iceberg above the sea, there are 3 below it. If these ice mountains are not more than 300 feet above the surface, they are not more than 900 beneath. And what are 900 feet to the Nautilus? Nothing. It could even seek at greater depths that uniform temperature of seawater, and there brave with impunity the 30 or 40 degrees of surface cold. Just so, sir. Just so, I replied, getting animated. The only difficulty, continued Captain Nemo, is that of remaining several days without renewing our provision of air. Is that all? The Nautilus has vast reservoirs. We can fill them. They will supply us with all the oxygen we want. Well thought of, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the captain, smiling. But not wishing you to accuse me of rashness, I will first give you all my objections. Have you any more to make? Only one. It is possible, if the sea exists at the South Pole, that it may be covered, and consequently we shall be unable to come to the surface. Good sir, would you forget that the Nautilus is armed with a powerful spur, and could we not send it diagonally against these fields of ice, which would open at the shocks? Ah, you are full of ideas today. Besides, why should we not find the sea open at the South Pole as well as at the North? The frozen poles of the Earth do not coincide, either in the southern or in the northern regions, and until it is proved to the contrary, we may suppose either a continent or an ocean free from ice at these 2 points of the globe. I think so too, Monsieur Aronnax. I only wish you to observe that after having made so many objections to my project, You are now crushing me with arguments in its favor. The preparations for this audacious attempt now begin. The powerful pumps of the Nautilus were working air into the reservoirs and storing it at high pressure. About 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo announced the closing of the panels on the platform. I threw one last look at the massive iceberg which we were going to cross. The weather was clear, the atmosphere pure enough, the cold very great, being 12 degrees below zero. But the wind having gone down, this temperature was not so unbearable. About 10 men mounted the sides of the Nautilus, armed with pickaxes to break the ice around the vessel, which was soon free. The operation was quickly performed, for the fresh ice was still very thin. We all went below. The usual reservoirs were filled with the newly liberated water, and the Nautilus soon descended. I had taken my place with Conseil in the saloon. Through the open window we could see the lower beds of the Southern Ocean. The thermometer went up. The needle of the compass deviated on the dial. At about 900 feet, as Captain Nemo had foreseen, we were floating beneath the undulating bottom of the iceberg. But the Nautilus went lower still. It went to the depth of 400 fathoms. The temperature of the water at the surface showed 12 degrees. It was now only 10. We had gained 2. I need not say the temperature of the Nautilus was raised by its heating apparatus to a much higher degree. Every maneuver was accomplished with wonderful precision. "We shall pass it, if you please, sir," said Conseil. "I believe we shall," I said in a tone of firm conviction. In this open sea, the Nautilus had taken its course direct to the pole without leaving the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 minutes to 90 degrees, 22 degrees and a half of latitude remained to travel. That is about 500 leagues. The Nautilus kept up a mean speed of 26 miles an hour, the speed of an express train. If that was kept up, in 40 hours we should reach the pole. For a part of the night, the novelty of the situation kept us at the window. The sea was lit with the electric lantern, but it was deserted. Fish did not sojourn in these imprisoned waters. They only found there a passage to take them from the Antarctic Ocean to the open polar sea. Our pace was rapid. We could feel it by the quivering of the long steel body. About 2 in the morning I took some hours' repose, and Conseil did the same. In crossing the waist I did not meet Captain Nemo. I supposed him to be in the pilot's cage. The next morning, March 19th, I took my post once more in the saloon. The electric log told me that the speed of the Nautilus had been slackened. It was then going toward the surface, but prudently emptying its reservoirs very slowly. My heart beat fast. Were we going to emerge and regain the open polar atmosphere? No. A shock told me that the Nautilus had struck the bottom of the iceberg, still very thick, judging from the deadened sound. We had indeed struck, to use a sea expression, but in an inverse sense, and at 1,000 feet deep. This would give 3,000 feet of ice above us, 1,000 being above the watermark. The iceberg was then higher than at its borders, not a very reassuring fact. Several times that day the Nautilus tried again, and every time it struck the wall which lay like a ceiling above it. Sometimes it met with but 900 yards, only 200 of which rose above the surface. It was twice the height it was when the Nautilus had gone into the waves. I carefully noted the different depths, and thus obtained a submarine profile of the chain as it was developed under the water. That night no change had taken place in our situation. Still ice between 400 and 500 yards in depth. It was evidently diminishing, but still, what a thickness between us and the surface of the ocean. It was then 8. According to the daily custom on board the Nautilus, its air should have been renewed 4 hours ago. But I did not suffer much, although Captain Nemo had not yet made any demand upon his reserve of oxygen. My sleep was painful that night. Hope and fear besieged me by turns. I rose several times. The groping of the Nautilus continued. About 3 in the morning, I noticed that the lower surface of the iceberg was only about 50 feet deep. 150 feet now separated us from the surface of the waters. The iceberg was by degrees becoming an ice field, the mountain a plain. My eyes never left the manometer. We were still rising diagonally to the surface, which sparkled in the electric rays. The iceberg was stretching both above and beneath into lengthening slopes. Mile after mile it was getting thinner. At length, at 6 in the morning of that memorable day, March 19th, the door of the saloon opened and Captain Nemo appeared. "The sea's open," was all he said. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The South Pole. I rushed onto the platform. Yes, the open sea with but a few scattered pieces of ice and moving icebergs, a long stretch of sea, a world of birds in the air, and myriads of fish under those waters, which varied from intense blue to olive green according to the bottom. The thermometer marked 3 degrees above zero. It was comparatively spring, shut up as we were behind the iceberg, whose lengthened mass was dimly seen on our northern horizon. "Are we at the pole?" I asked the captain with a beating heart. "I do not know," he replied. "At noon I will take our bearings." "But will the sun show himself through this fog?" said I, looking at the leaden sky. "However little it shows, it will be enough," replied the captain. About 10 miles south, the solitary island rose to a height of 104 yards. We made for it, but carefully, for the sea might be strewn with banks. 1 hour afterward we had reached it. 2 hours later we had made the round of it. It measured 4 or 5 miles in circumference. A narrow canal separated it from a considerable stretch of land, perhaps a continent, for we could not see its limits. The existence of this land seemed to give some color to Maury's theory. The ingenious American has remarked that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea is covered with floating ice of enormous size, which is never met with in the North Atlantic. From this fact he has drawn the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle encloses considerable continents, as icebergs cannot form an open sea, but only on the coasts. According to these calculations, the mass of ice surrounding the southern pole forms a vast cap, the circumference of which must be, at least, 2,500 miles. But the Nautilus, for fear of running aground, had stopped about 3 cable lengths from a strand over which reared a superb heap of rocks. The boat was launched. The captain, 2 of his men, bearing instruments, Conseil and myself were in it. It was 10 in the morning. I had not seen Ned Land. Doubtless the Canadian did not wish to admit the presence of the South Pole. A few strokes of the oar brought us to the sand, where we ran ashore. Conseil was going to jump onto the land when I held him back. "Sir," said I to Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honor of first footing, sir." "Sir," said I to Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honor of first setting foot on this land." "Yes, sir," said the captain, "and if I do not hesitate to tread this South Pole, it is because, up to this time, no human being has left a trace there." Saying this, he jumped lightly onto the sand. His heart beat with emotion. He climbed a rock, sloping to a little promontory, and there, with his arms crossed, mute and motionless, and with an eager look, he seemed to take possession of these southern regions. After 5 minutes passed in this ecstasy, he turned to us. "When you like, sir." I landed, followed by Conseil, leaving the 2 men in the boat. For a long way, the soil was composed of a reddish, sandy stone, something like crushed brick, scoriae, streams of lava, and pumice stones. One could not mistake its volcanic origin. In some parts, slight curls of smoke emitted a sulphurous smell, proving that the internal fires had lost nothing of their expansive powers, though, having climbed high acclivity, I could see no volcano for a radius of several miles. We know that in those Antarctic countries, James Ross found 2 craters, the Erebus and Terror, in full activity on the 167th meridian, latitude 77 degrees 32 minutes. The vegetation of this desolate continent seemed to be much restricted. Some lichens lay upon the black rocks, some microscopic plants, rudimentary diatomas, a kind of cells placed between 2 quartz shells, long purple and scarlet weed supported on little swimming bladders, which the breaking of the waves brought to the shore. These constituted the meager flora of this region. The shore was strewn with mollusks, little mussels, and limpets. I also saw myriads of northern Cleos, 1¼ inches long, of which a whale would swallow a whole world at a mouthful, and some perfect sea butterflies animating the waters on the skirts of the shore. There appeared on the high bottoms some coral shrubs of the kind which, according to James Ross, live in the Antarctic seas to the depth of more than 1,000 yards. Then there were little kingfishers and starfish studding the soil. But where life abounded most was in the air. There thousands of birds fluttered and flew of all kinds, deafening us with their cries. Others crowded the rock, looking at us as we passed by without fear, and pressing familiarly close by our feet. There were penguins, so agile in the water, heavy and awkward as they are on the ground. They were uttering harsh cries, a large assembly, sober in gesture, but extravagant in clamor. Albatrosses passed in the air, the expanse of their wings being at least 4 yards and a half, and justly called the vultures of the ocean. Some gigantic petrels, and some damiers, a kind of small duck, the under part of whose body is black and white. Then there were a whole series of petrels, some whitish with brown-bordered wings, others blue, peculiar to the Antarctic seas, and so oily, as I told Conseil, that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands had nothing to do before lighting them but to put a wick in. "A little more," said Conseil, "and they would be perfect lamps. After that, we could not expect nature to have previously furnished them with wicks." About half a mile farther on, the soil was riddled with ruff's nests, a sort of laying ground out of which many birds were issuing. Captain Nemo had some hundreds hunted. They uttered a cry like the braying of an ass, were about the size of a goose, slate-gray color on the body, white beneath, with a yellow line around their throats. They allowed themselves to be killed with a stone, never trying to escape. But the fog did not lift, and at 11 the sun had not yet shown itself. Its absence made me uneasy. Without it, no observations were possible. How, then, could we decide whether we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning on a piece of rock, silently watching the sky. He seemed impatient and vexed. But what was to be done? This rash and powerful man could not command the sun as he did the sea. Noon arrived without the orb of day showing itself for an instant. We could not even tell its position behind the curtain of fog, and soon the fog turned to snow. "Till tomorrow," said the captain quietly, and we returned to the Nautilus amid these atmospheric disturbances. The tempest of snow continued till the next day. It was impossible to remain on the platform. From the saloon, where I was taking notes of incidents happening during this excursion to the polar continent, I could hear the cries of petrels and albatrosses sporting in the midst of this violent storm. The Nautilus did not remain motionless, but skirted the coast, advancing 10 miles more to the south than the half-light left by the sun as it skirted the edge of the horizon. The next day, March 20th, the snow had ceased. The cold was a little greater, the thermometer showing 2 degrees below zero. The fog was rising, and I hoped that that day our observations might be taken. Captain Nemo not having yet appeared, the boat took Conseil and myself to land. The soil was still of the same volcanic nature. Everywhere were traces of lava, scoriae, and basalt, but the crater which had vomited them I could not see. Here, as lower down, this continent was alive with myriads of birds, but their rule was now divided with large troops of sea mammals, looking at us with their soft eyes. There were several kinds of seals, some stretched on the earth, some on flakes of ice, many going in and out of the sea. They did not flee at our approach, never having had anything to do with man, and I reckon that there were provisions there for hundreds of vessels. "Sir," said Conseil, "will you tell me the names of these creatures?" "They are seals and morses." It was now 8 in the morning. 4 hours remained to us before the sun could be observed with advantage. I directed our steps toward a vast bay cut in the steep granite shore. There I can aver that earth and ice were lost to sight by the numbers of sea mammals covering them, and I involuntarily sought for old Proteus, the mythological shepherd who watched these immense flocks of Neptune. There were more seals than anything else, forming distinct groups, male and female, the father watching over his family, the mother suckling her little ones, some already strong enough to go a few steps. When they wished to change their place, they took little jumps made by the contraction of their bodies and helped awkwardly enough by their imperfect fin, which, as with the lamantine, their cousins, forms a perfect forearm. I should say that in the water, which is their element, the spine of these creatures is flexible with smooth and close skin and webbed feet. They swim admirably. In resting on the earth, they take the most graceful attitudes. Thus the ancients, observing their soft and expressive looks, which cannot be surpassed by the most beautiful look a woman can give, their clear, voluptuous eyes, their charming positions, and the poetry of their manners, metamorphosed them, the male into a triton, the female into a mermaid. I made Conseil notice the considerable development of the lobes of the brain, these interesting cetaceans. No mammal except man has such a quantity of brain matter. They are also capable of receiving a certain amount of education, are easily domesticated, and I think, with other naturalists, that if properly taught they would be of great service as fishing dogs. The greater part of them slept on the rocks or on the sand. Among these seals, properly so called, which have no external ears, in which they differ from the otter, whose ears are prominent, I noticed several varieties of seals about 3 yards long, with a white coat, bulldog heads, armed with teeth in both jaws, 4 incisors at the top and 4 at the bottom, and 2 large canine teeth in the shape of a fleur-de-lis. Among them glided sea elephants, a kind of seal with short, flexible trunks. The giants of this species measured 20 feet around and 10 yards and a half in length, but they did not move as we approached. "These creatures are not dangerous?" asked Conseil. "No, not unless you attack them. When they have to defend their young, their rage is terrible, and it is not uncommon for them to break the fishing boats to pieces." "They are quite right," said Conseil. "I do not say they are not." 2 miles farther on, we were stopped by the promontory which shelters the bay from the southerly winds. Beyond it, we heard loud bellowing such as a troop of ruminants would produce. "Good," said Conseil. "A concert of bulls." "No, a concert of morses." "They are fighting." "They are either fighting or playing." We now began to climb the blackish rocks amid unforeseen stumbles and over stones which the ice made slippery. More than once I rolled over at the expense of my loins. Conseil, more prudent or more steady, did not stumble and helped me up, saying, "If, sir, you would have the kindness to take wider steps, you would preserve your equilibrium better." Arrived at the upper ridge of the promontory, I saw a vast white plain covered with morses. They were playing among themselves, and what we heard were bellowings of pleasure, not of anger. As I passed these curious animals, I could examine them leisurely, for they did not move. Their skins were thick and rugged, of a yellowish tint approaching to red. Their hair was short and scant. Some of them were 4 yards and a quarter long. Quieter and less timid than their cousins of the north, they did not, like them, place sentinels around the outskirts of their encampment. After examining this city of morses, I began to think of returning. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo found the conditions favorable for observations, I wished to be present at the operation. We followed a narrow pathway running along the summit of a steep shore. At 11:30, we had reached the place where we landed. The boat had run aground, bringing the captain. I saw him standing on a block of basalt, his instruments near him, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon, near which the sun was then describing a lengthened curve. I took my place beside him and waited without speaking. Noon arrived, and as before, the sun did not appear. It was a fatality. Observations were still wanting. If not accomplished tomorrow, we must give up all idea of taking any. We were indeed exactly at March 20th. Tomorrow, the 21st, would be the equinox. The sun would disappear behind the horizon for 6 months, and with its disappearance the long polar night would begin. Since the September equinox, it had emerged from the northern horizon, rising by lengthened spirals up to December 21. At this period, the summer solstice of the northern regions, it had begun to descend, and tomorrow was to shed its last rays upon them. I communicated my fears and observations to Captain Nemo. "You are right, Monsieur Aronnax," said he. "If tomorrow I cannot take the altitude of the sun, I shall not be able to do it for 6 months. But precisely because chance has led me into these seas on the 21st of March, my bearings will be easy to take if at 12 we can see the sun." "Why, Captain?" "Because then the orb of day described such lengthened curves that it is difficult to measure exactly its height above the horizon, and grave errors may be made with instruments." "What will you do then?" "I shall only use my chronometer," replied Captain Nemo. "If tomorrow, the 21st of March, the disk of the sun, allowing for refraction, is exactly cut by the northern horizon, it will show that I am at the South Pole." "Just so? But this statement is not mathematically correct, because the equinox does not necessarily begin at noon." "Very likely, sir. But the error will not be 100 yards, and we do not want more. Till tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo returned on board. Conseil and I remained to survey the shore, observing and studying until 5 o'clock. Then I went to bed, not, however, without invoking, like the Indian, the favor of the radiant orb. The next day, March 21st, at 5 in the morning, I mounted the platform. I found Captain Nemo there. "The weather is lightening a little," said he. "I have some hope. After breakfast, we will go on shore and choose a post for observation." That point settled, I sought out Ned Land. I wanted to take him with me, but the obstinate Canadian refused, and I saw that his taciturnity and his bad humor grew day by day. After all, I was not sorry for his obstinacy under the circumstances. Indeed, there were too many seals on shore, and we ought not to lay such temptation in this unreflecting fisherman's way. Breakfast over, we went on shore. The Nautilus had gone some miles farther up in the night. It was a whole league from the coast, above which reared a sharp peak about 500 yards high. The boat took with me Captain Nemo, 2 men of the crew, and the instruments, which consisted of a chronometer, a telescope, and a barometer. While crossing, I saw numerous whales belonging to the 3 kinds peculiar to the southern seas: the whale, or the English right whale, which has no dorsal fin; the humpback, with reeved chest and large whitish fins, which in spite of its name do not form wings; and the finback, of a yellowish brown, the liveliest of all the cetacea. This powerful creature is heard a long way off when he throws to a great height columns of air and vapor, which look like whirlwinds of smoke. These different mammals were disporting themselves in troops in the quiet waters. These different animals were disporting themselves in troops in the quiet waters, and I could see that this basin of the Antarctic pole serves as a place of refuge to the cetacea too closely tracked by the hunters. I also noticed large medusae floating between the reeds. At 9 we landed. The sky was brightening, the clouds were flying to the south, and the fog seemed to be leaving the cold surface of the waters. Captain Nemo went toward the peak, which he doubtless meant to be his observatory. It was a painful ascent over the sharp lava and the pumice stones, and an atmosphere often impregnated with a sulphurous smell from the smoking cracks. For a man unaccustomed to walk on land, the captain climbed the steep slopes with an agility I never saw equaled, and which a hunter would have envied. We were 2 hours getting to the summit of this peak, which was half porphyry and half basalt. From thence we looked upon a vast sea, which, toward the north, distinctly traced its boundary line upon the sky. At our feet lay fields of dazzling whiteness, over our heads a pale azure, free from fog. To the north, the disk of the sun seemed like a ball of fire, already horned by the cutting of the horizon. From the bosom of the water rose sheaves of liquid jets by hundreds. In the distance lay the Nautilus like a cetacean asleep on the water. Behind us, to the south and east, an immense country and a chaotic heap of rocks and ice, the limits of which were not visible. On arriving at the summit, Captain Nemo carefully took the mean height of the barometer, for he would have to consider that in taking his observations. At 11:45, the sun, then seen only by refraction, looked like a golden disk shedding its last rays upon this deserted continent and seas which never man had yet plowed. Captain Nemo, furnished with a lenticular glass which by means of a mirror corrected the refraction, watched the orb sinking below the horizon by degrees, following a lengthened diagonal. I held the chronometer. My heart beat fast. If the disappearance of the half-disk of the sun coincided with 12 o'clock of the chronometer, we were at the pole itself. 12, I exclaimed. The South Pole, replied Captain Nemo in a grave voice, handing me the glass, which showed the orb cut in exactly equal parts by the horizon. I looked at the last rays crowning the peak, and the shadows mounting by degrees up its slopes. At that moment, Captain Nemo, resting with his hand on my shoulder, said, I, Captain Nemo, on this 21st day of March, 1868, have reached the South Pole on the 90th degree, and I take possession of this part of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents. In whose name, Captain? In my own. Saying which, Captain Nemo unfurled a black banner bearing an N in gold quartered on its bunting. Then, turning toward the orb of day, whose last rays lapped the horizon of the sea, exclaimed, Adieu, sun. Disappear, thou radiant orb. Rest beneath this open sea, and let the night of 6 months spread its shadows over my new domain. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Accident or Incident. The next day, March 22nd at 6 in the morning, preparations for departure were begun. The last gleams of twilight were melting into night. The cold was great. The constellations shone with wonderful intensity. In the zenith glittered that wondrous Southern Cross, the polar bear of Antarctic regions. The thermometer showed 12 degrees below zero, and when the wind freshened, it was most biting. Flakes of ice increased on the open water. The sea seemed everywhere alike. Numerous blackish patches spread on the surface, showing the formation of fresh ice. Evidently the southern basin, frozen during the 6 winter months, was absolutely inaccessible. What became of the whales in that time? Doubtless they went beneath the icebergs, seeking more practicable seas. As to the seals and morses, accustomed to live in a hard climate, they remained on these icy shores. These creatures have the instinct to break holes in the ice field and to keep them open. To these holes they come for breath. When the birds, driven away by the cold, have immigrated to the north, these sea mammals remain sole masters of the polar continent. But the reservoirs were filling with water, and the Nautilus was slowly descending. At 1,000 feet deep it stopped, its screw beat the waves, and it advanced straight toward the north at a speed of 15 miles an hour. Toward night, it was already floating upon the immense body of the iceberg. At 3 in the morning I was awakened by a violent shock. I sat up in my bed and listened in the darkness, when I was thrown into the middle of the room. The Nautilus, after having struck, had rebounded violently. I groped along the partition and by the staircase to the saloon, which was lit by the luminous ceiling. The furniture was upset. Fortunately, the windows were firmly set and held fast. The pictures on the starboard side, from being no longer vertical, were clinging to the paper, while those of the port side were hanging at least a foot from the wall. The Nautilus was lying on its starboard side, perfectly motionless. I heard footsteps and a confusion of voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. As I was leaving the saloon, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What is the matter?" said I at once. "I came to ask you, sir," replied Conseil. "Confound it!" exclaimed the Canadian. "I know well enough. The Nautilus has struck, and judging by the way she lies, I do not think she'll right herself as she did the first time in the Torres Straits." "But," I asked, "has she at least come to the surface of the sea?" "We do not know," said Conseil. "It is easy to decide," I answered. I consulted the manometer. To my great surprise, it showed a depth of more than 180 fathoms. "What does that mean?" I exclaimed. "We must ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "But where shall we find him?" said Ned Land. "Follow me," said I to my companions. We left the saloon. There was no one in the library. At the center staircase by the berths of the ship's crew, there was no one. I thought that Captain Nemo must be in the pilot's cage. It was best to wait. We all returned to the saloon. For 20 minutes we remained thus, trying to hear the slightest noise which might be made on board the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He seemed not to see us. His face, generally so impassive, showed signs of uneasiness. He watched the compass silently, then the manometer, and going to the planisphere, placed his finger on a spot representing the southern seas. I would not interrupt him, but some minutes later, when he turned toward me, I said, using one of his own expressions in the Torres Straits, "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir. An accident this time." "Serious?" "Perhaps." "Is the danger immediate?" "No." "The Nautilus is stranded?" "Yes."
"And this has happened how?"
"From a caprice of nature, not from the ignorance of man. Not a mistake has been made in the working, but we cannot prevent equilibrium from producing its effects. We may brave human laws, but we cannot resist natural ones." Captain Nemo had chosen a strange moment for uttering this philosophical reflection. On the whole, his answer helped me little.
"May I ask, sir, the cause of the accident?"
"An enormous block of ice, a whole mountain, has turned over," he replied. "When icebergs are undermined at their base by warmer water, reiterated shocks, their center of gravity rises, and the whole thing turns over. This is what has happened. One of these blocks, as it fell, struck the Nautilus, then, gliding under its hull, raised it with irresistible force, bringing it into beds which are not so thick, where it is lying on its side."
"But can we not get the Nautilus off by emptying its reservoirs, that it might regain its equilibrium?"
"That, sir, is being done at this moment. You can hear the pump working. Look at the needle of the manometer. It shows that the Nautilus is rising, but the block of ice is floating with it, and until some obstacle stops its ascending motion, our position cannot be altered."
Indeed, the Nautilus still held the same position to starboard. Doubtless it would right itself if the block stopped, but at this moment, who knows if we may not be frightfully crushed between the two glassy surfaces. I reflected on all the consequences of our position. Captain Nemo never took his eyes off the manometer. Since the fall of the iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it still made the same angle with the perpendicular. Suddenly a slight movement was felt in the hold. Evidently it was righting a little. Things hanging in the saloon were sensibly returning to their normal position. The partitions were nearing the upright. No one spoke. With beating hearts we watched and felt the straightening. The boards became horizontal under our feet. 10 minutes passed. "At last we've righted."
"Yes," said Captain Nemo, going to the door of the saloon.
"But are we floating?" I asked.
"Certainly," he replied, "since the reservoirs are not empty, and when empty the Nautilus must rise to the surface of the sea."
We were in open sea, but at a distance of about 10 yards on either side of the Nautilus rose a dazzling wall of ice. Above and beneath the same wall, above, because the lower surface of the iceberg stretched over us like an immense ceiling; beneath, because the overturned block, having slid by degrees, had found a resting place on the lateral walls, which kept it in that position. The Nautilus was really imprisoned in a perfect tunnel of ice, more than 20 yards in breadth, filled with quiet water. It was easy to get out of it by going either forward or backward, and then make a free passage under the iceberg, some hundreds of yards deeper. The luminous ceiling had been extinguished, but the saloon was still resplendent with intense light. It was the powerful reflection from the glass partitions and violently back to the sheets of the lantern. I cannot describe the effect of the voltaic rays upon the great blocks so capriciously cut. Upon every angle, every ridge, every facet was thrown a different light, according to the nature of the veins running through the ice. A dazzling mine of gems, particularly sapphires, their blue rays crossing with the green of the emerald. Here and there were opal shades of wonderful softness, running through bright spots like diamonds of fire, the brilliancy of which the eye could not bear. The power of the lantern seemed increased 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenticular plates of a first-class lighthouse. "How beautiful! How beautiful!" cried Conseil. "Yes," I said. "It is a wonderful sight, is it not, Ned?" "Yes, confounded, yes," answered Ned Land. "It is superb. I'm mad at being obliged to admit it. No one has ever seen anything like it. But the sight may cost us dear. And if I must say all, I think we're seeing here things which God never intended man to see." And Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly a cry from Conseil made me turn. "What is it?" I asked. "Shut your eyes, sir. Do not look, sir." Saying which, Conseil clapped his hands over his eyes. "But what is the matter, my boy?" "I'm dazzled, blinded." My eyes turned involuntarily toward the glass, but I could not stand the fire which seemed to devour them. I understood what had happened. The Nautilus had put on full speed. All the quiet luster of the ice walls was at once changed into flashes of lightning. The fire from these myriads of diamonds was blinding. It required some time to calm our troubled looks. At last the hands were taken down. "Faith, I should never have believed it," said Conseil. It was then 5 in the morning, and at that moment a shock was felt at the bows of the Nautilus. I knew that its spur had struck a block of ice. It must have been a false maneuver, for this submarine tunnel obstructed by blocks was not very easy navigation. I thought that Captain Nemo, by changing his course, would either turn these obstacles or else follow the windings of the tunnel. In any case, the road before us could not be entirely blocked. But contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus took a decided retrograde motion. "We are going backward," said Conseil. "Yes," I replied. "This end of the tunnel can have no egress." "And then?" "Then," said I, "the working is easy. We must go back again and go out at the southern opening. That is all." In speaking thus, I wished to appear more confident than I really was, but the retrograde motion of the Nautilus was increasing, and reversing the screw, it carried us at great speed. "It will be a hindrance," said Ned. "What does it matter some hours more or less, provided we get out at last?" "Yes," repeated Ned Land, "provided we do get out at last." For a short time I walked from the saloon to the library. My companions were silent. I soon threw myself on an ottoman and took a book, which my eyes overran mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Conseil, approaching me, said, Is what you are reading very interesting, sir?" "Very interesting," I replied. "I should think so, sir. It is your own book you're reading." "My book?" And indeed I was holding my book, The Great Submarine Depths. I did not even dream of it. I closed the book and returned to my walk. Ned and Conseil rose to go. "Stay here, my friends," said I, detaining them. "Let us remain together until we're out of this block." "As you please, sir," Conseil replied. Some hours passed. I often looked at the instruments hanging from the partition. The manometer showed that the Nautilus kept at a constant depth of more than 300 yards. The compass still pointed south. The log indicated a speed of 20 miles an hour, which in such a cramped space was very great, but Captain Nemo knew that he could not hasten too much, and that minutes were worth ages to us. At 25 minutes past 8, a second shock took place, this time from behind. I turned pale. My companions were close by my side. I seized Conseil's hand. Our looks expressed our feelings better than words. At this moment the captain entered the saloon. I went up to him. "Our course is barred southward?" I asked. "Yes, sir. The iceberg has shifted and closed Every outlet. Are blocked up then?
Yes. End of chapter 15. Quite the story so far. What will happen next to those aboard the Nautilus? Tune in next time and find out. And in the meantime, if you've enjoyed the story, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment if you would. It really helps us out.